Welcome to Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. Today we will take a closer look at all the graphics settings for Cold War and we will adjust them so that you can increase your chances of dominating the scoreboard. In other words, we will be looking for the best settings so that you can have the advantage over everybody else. This is how the game looks on Ultra settings. I chose this scene because it's very easy to spot the differences of all the graphics settings. In the top left corner you can see the frames per second. I recorded this video with OBS, so there is a performance impact, but then again, a lot of people record their footage nowadays anyway, so I might as well show you the numbers while actually recording. If you don't, then your frames will go up of course. Everything was recorded in 1440p on a PC with an Intel i9 9900K, an RTX 2080 Ti and 32GB of memory. This video is not purely about maxing out your frames per second, it's also about clarity and visibility. Let's cover the extremes first. On Ultra, the game looks like this. What you see here is Call of Duty in all of its glory. It doesn't get any better than what you see now. On the other side, we have this. These are the lowest settings. There are a lot of settings that you can turn off and this is the result of doing that. The difference is very noticeable. Look at the textures on the walls and the ground. Overall, the game is now a blurry mess. Okay, we have covered the extremes. Let's now check out the optimal settings so that you can get an advantage out of this. For info, I will share the performance gain as well for each individual setting. But know that when you combine all of these settings together, which I will show you at the end of the video, that the performance gains for each setting are in fact higher. Our starting point is as follows. Full screen, VSync off to uncap the frame rate, NVIDIA Reflex low latency enabled and boosted, render resolution 100, field of view 120, all other settings are maxed out except ray tracing and motion blur have been disabled. Realistically speaking, almost nobody uses ray tracing consistently and motion blur is probably the last thing people want in a video game. Alright, let's get started. The game tells us that the texture quality adjusts the resolution of textures, but what does that actually mean? I chose this scene to do our basic tests. This is what Cold War looks like with texture quality on Ultra. The most noticeable change that takes place as we lower the setting is a change in quality of the bush right in front of us. It starts off as a very nice and realistic bush and it changes over to something extremely basic and somewhat ridiculous. My first impression was gotcha. I just started working on this video and we already have a game-breaking advantage like in some of the previous graphic settings guides that I made, where we discovered that certain settings make rocks and other obstacles disappear, so that we can see the enemy but they can't see us. Unfortunately, the developers have learned from those videos. Yes, standing behind this bush with certain settings means that I can see you but that you can't see me. But we cannot access this area. That is the problem. So every time that a bush like this changes so dramatically, it means that this bush is located in an inaccessible area. All other bushes that are located within the playable area are not going to change to the same extent. So we will have to go deeper to really see what this setting does. For that, I chose this scene. Focus on the clarity of the text in front of you, the tiles on the floor and the wall on the far left. This is what this room looks like on Ultra. As we lower the setting, we're going to lose a lot of detail. And eventually we're going to end up with this, the lowest settings. I think we can all agree that this is a little bit too low. Look at the carpet on the left hand side. It's almost impossible to determine that it's a carpet in the first place, right? The same goes for the walls, something is terribly wrong here. But when we then use the next setting, which is low, then we regain a lot of detail. We can now see that it's an actual carpet we were looking at and the walls have a pattern again. I can definitely live with this. On top of that, we have a performance gain of 4 frames in this scene. If you really want to, you could go for medium, which makes the pattern on the wall much clearer, but there isn't really a change to the carpet on the left hand side and there is no performance gain anymore. So, you now have an excellent idea of what the texture quality does in Cold War. The model quality is a bit strange because it doesn't seem to do anything. No matter where I go on this map, or any other map for that matter, and change the setting, there are no visual or performance changes. So for now, I would just set this setting to low just to be sure. The last thing that you want is an FPS drop in the middle of a fight when this thing kicks in. HD game textures and models goes hand in hand with texture quality, not with the model quality like the in-game's explanation is suggesting. You will only get access to the HD game textures and models if you use the Ultra Texture Quality setting. The developers have confirmed this. You can install this if you like, but I wouldn't bother if you're not planning to use the Ultra Texture Quality setting. In this scene, the difference is exactly 1 frame. The 4K interface and textures uses the Ultra High Definition pack of textures for the interface. So for the settings, menus and so on. They are meant for 4K monitors, so I used the 4K monitor, and this is the difference. All the vertical and horizontal lines get a quality bump, and the difference is very noticeable. The text of the actual setting itself on the left hand side does not change, but the text on the right hand side, so inside the description of the setting, does get a bump in clarity. Special effects quality has no noticeable effect whatsoever. It's supposed to change the quality of the resolution used for special effects such as fire. So I went to every single source of fire I could find, but even after restarting the game, there is no change whatsoever. Not in performance and nothing that was visually noticeable. I retested this with various kinds of explosions in case that is what they meant with fire, but nothing. They all look the same. Screen space reflection enables the light to reflect. For example, if you look at a puddle of water at a certain angle, you can see the light of this building reflecting in it. First of all, you cannot max out this setting. It only accepts low no matter what you do. I then went over to the exact same spot as in the image they used to explain what this does, and yes, I can see the light reflecting. Then I disable the setting, restart the entire game just to be sure, and I can still see the light reflecting in the water. How does that make sense? I think that this setting is broken, up to a certain extent, but right now there is nothing you can do to change it. As soon as they fix this, I will write a comment on this video to explain which setting to use, so keep an eye on the comments if you watch this video sometime after launch. In real life, when a stone is wet, it usually appears to be a little bit darker than it actually is, and this is what this setting tries to mimic. I just wish they explained their settings properly, but then again, in that case there's no point for me to make this video, right? So thank you very much, developers. On top of that, we gained 2 extra frames. Object view distance determines how far the game will render objects on your screen. In some games this has a very big impact, but not in Call of Duty Cold War. Here it only affects small objects like the lights on the building on the right and the air conditioners on the wall of the apartment complex in front of us. On low, these objects completely disappear and you will gain 2 frames. Volumetric lighting, aka God rays, is something we have seen before in various games. Sometimes this comes at a great performance cost, but in other games there isn't much of a difference, and the same is valid for Cold War. Going from high to low didn't change much visually, and to be honest with you, I would have preferred to be able to turn them off completely, but we can't. The only thing that changed were my frames per second. On low I saw an improvement of 3 to 5 frames. The shadow quality setting is a big thing in Call of Duty. Focus on the shadows on the building on the right hand side. On Ultra we start off with a very nice and detailed shadow, but as we get closer to low, things are definitely changing. We are losing a lot of detail and the end result is very different from our starting point. The great thing is that we gain 12 to 16 frames. If I then turn on all ray tracing options, then this shadow changes again in ways I didn't even expect. So you have to be aware that certain settings affect other settings in very different ways. Now, should you care about shadows? Not really, but you have to be aware of the options that you have. The only thing that really matters is that you can see the shadow of your opponents, right? Because that is something that is going to help you. For example, in Warzone I've encountered many moments where an enemy was on top of a rooftop and I was running around on the ground floor and I could clearly see the shadow of my enemy because the sun was behind him. So I knew where it was, and that's all that matters. I do want to show you what the game is capable of, because I have to say it's really impressive. If I turn on all ray tracing options, then we get an extremely accurate ray traced shadow of the weapon that I'm currently holding in my hands. It's super clear and super detailed. The technology is definitely there. Dynamic shadows allows a dynamic object to render a shadow. For example, a moving player like we just discussed with the Warzone example. In Black Ops Cold War, you will have to turn on the dynamic shadows for all dynamic objects. Because if you select self only, then you will not see the enemy shadow. If you disable the setting, then you won't see your own shadow, which is fine. The ability to see your opponent's shadow can give you an advantage as discussed before. So this is an option that we might have to turn on. and as you could have guessed, this comes at a performance cost. Depending on where you are, this cost can be quite large. In this scene, where I am looking at my own shadow, I gain 15 to 16 frames when I disable the setting. So it's a significant penalty for something that isn't going to benefit you every game that you play, because realistically, you're not going to make a kill in every match purely because you saw a shadow before you saw the player. Personally, I'm going to turn the setting on because of how my PC works, the resolution that I play in, the maximum refresh rate of my monitor, and the frames per second that I get with my optimal settings, which you will see at the end of the video. Special Effect Shadow gives shadows to particles that you see when something explodes or during other special effects. Please disable the setting. There is also no performance gain. Weapon Shadow enables or disables the shadows of your own weapon. Pay close attention to my left arm. As you can see, there is no shadow, right? Even though the sun is on the right hand side and the weapon should cast a shadow on my arm. If I then go into settings and enable Weapon Shadow, then you will now see the shadow of my gun on my left arm. On average, you will gain 2 frames by disabling this setting. Just to be clear, when you look at your very own shadow on the wall, you will still see your weapon with this setting disabled. I've already shown you a few things that ray tracing can do in Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, and we all know that this makes your game look incredible. But unfortunately, the performance impact is still way too high, so we're going to turn off all of these settings because they don't make sense in a game like this. Ray tracing deserves its very own video, and there's no point to cover it to that extent in this one. What I will say is that in our main scene, where we normally get 123 frames, with ray tracing on, we now get 78, which is a 45 FPS difference. NVIDIA DLSS is also one of those settings that deserves its very own video, but I will tell you already what you need to know. In essence, it renders a lower resolution image and uses AI to upscale it so that it looks similar to what you have without DLSS, but with more frames. I don't think that you can explain it shorter and easier than that, but of course there's a lot more to it. In Cold War, you can disable the setting, or you can go for Ultra Performance, which offers the highest performance boost, and oh boy does that. I went from 123 frames to 198, which is absolutely incredible. It is recommended to be used for AK gameplay, but let's be honest, how many of us have ever done that? However, it does not prevent you from using it in 1080p, 1440p or 4K. The biggest downside is that you will have to deal with a blurry and darker image. When I go back and forward between disabled and ultra performance, then you can clearly see the darker image. What you will also notice is that the painting on the wall on the left hand side becomes blurry. The same goes for the flag on the left, and the text on the right suffers from the same downsides. If we then go for the performance mode, which is recommended for 4K and offers a higher performance boost than balanced with 178 frames, then you will see that the image is less dark but still darker than before. The text, painting and flags are a little bit clearer now, but still, it's not ideal yet. So let's go for balanced. The text is pretty clear and I don't notice that much of a difference anymore, and the same goes for all the other items. They say that Balanced offers both optimized performance and image quality, and yeah, that is absolutely the case. We did lose about 10 frames compared to the performance mode, but we gained a lot more in clarity. The last setting is called Quality, and as the name suggests it offers a higher image quality. Man, who could have guessed that one, eh? Good thing they keep things easy for us. And yes, you can notice a slight quality improvement when you look at the text on the right hand side. Other than that, I can't really notice anything. On top of that, we just lost another 10 frames. So now we're down to 158, which is still a lot better than the 123 we started out with, without DLSS. If I then compare DLSS disabled with the quality setting, then yes, you will still notice a slight quality difference because the image is less clear. This is most pronounced in the second flag on the left hand side. And yes, the image is a tiny bit darker, but for 35 extra frames, it's pretty nice overall. Based on what we just saw, I would recommend to use Balanced, because the only noticeable difference with quality is the text, so who cares? You're not going to really notice this in game, but the 10 extra frames are more than welcome, right? Compared to DLSS disabled, we are now getting 45 extra frames. Thank you very much, NVIDIA. When DLSS is enabled, it will replace the anti-aliasing quality, so this setting only matters if you decide not to use DLSS. In that case, you're forced to do something with the anti-aliasing setting, and I would choose for medium, aka Filmic SMAA 1X. It is the most balanced setting for Call of Duty Cold War. It strikes the perfect balance between performance and clarity. If you select medium, then this number will not fall lower than 119, so it's a good trade-off between consistency and clarity, and you will gain 4 frames. Ambient Occlusion creates soft shadows that can intersect with each other. Not exactly something that might win you the game, so there is no advantage to be found except for aesthetic reasons. Turning it off will give you another 7 extra frames. Our main scene isn't the best place to test this out, but do know that the 3 highest settings didn't visually change anything. However, there were a few frames that we gained every time by lowering this setting. Overall, you could say that disabling this setting makes the game a little bit brighter. Motion blur is something gamers will try to avoid at all costs, because it destroys the clarity of the game itself. Even when you're standing still in Black Ops Cold War, you're not really standing perfectly still. When you do not give any inputs with your keyboard, mouse or controller, your character will always be moving around a little bit. That is the reason why turning motion blur on will cause a performance hit. In this case, the motion blur is barely noticeable, but it doesn't mean that it isn't there. If you disable motion blur, then you will gain another 4 frames. Motion blur is nice for certain movies, but not for games. So do what most of us do and turn it off so that you can enjoy the extra clarity and the extra frames. I will skip motion blur quality, because in the stationary scene it's not possible to describe the difference, and with motion blur on, the FPS did not change at all when it changed the motion blur quality. Since we're not going to use motion blur anyway, select low just to be sure, and let's move on. Apparently, subsurface scattering simulates light that's absorbed and diffused when passing through different materials. If you enable it, you will get a more realistic rendering of human faces. It does not matter if I have this setting turned on or off. No matter what I do, I cannot see any noticeable difference in human faces. Having said that, how many times have you been close enough to somebody that you're trying to kill that you start noticing these subtle changes in the person's face? Me, never in an actual game, so let's just disable the setting. A higher quality, order-independent transparency will increase the amount of transparent effects and objects that are sorted when looking through them. I did not notice any difference in our static scene, and I even went to the exact same part of the map that they show when they describe the setting, and even after restarting the game, the tail light never changed, so there is no noticeable difference. But something is definitely happening, because there is a performance difference of 7 frames. And that's a lot for something that you can't really see, so it's an easy decision. Disable it. The last setting depends on your PC, so this is something that you will have to decide according to your PC specs. You shouldn't be running many programs in the background when you're gaming, so I would suggest setting the VRAM usage target to high. If you don't notice any issues, then just leave it on high. The more VRAM your game has access to, the better a game's performance can be. The display gamma depends on your monitor or TV, for those that play on a TV. Try to match this with your monitor or TV specs and you'll be fine. The display adapter is your graphics card. Usually auto-select will choose the right one for you, but in very remote cases you might have to do this yourself if you get extremely low frames per second. Alright, conclusion time. The absolute best graphic settings for clarity, visibility and performance in Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War are: texture quality on low for 4 extra frames, model quality on low, HD game textures and models installed if you have space in your SSD or HD, 4K interface textures enabled, because your interface looks better, it doesn't really change anything in-game. Special effects quality to medium, screen space reflection disabled for 2 extra frames, object view distance on low for 2 extra frames, volumetric lighting on low for 3 to 5 extra frames, shadow quality on low for 12 to 16 frames. For ray tracing, you get 50 frames more instead of having 70. Dynamic shadows, if you enable it, you will lose 6 frames. If you disable it, you will gain 6 frames, but it also depends on where you go to. It can go up to 16 frames. Special effects shadows disabled. Weapon shadow disabled for 2 extra frames. All ray tracing options disabled. You will gain too many frames, in other words 45. NVIDA DLSS Balanced for another 45 frames. Anti-aliasing to medium if you're not using DLSS. Ambient Occlusion disabled for 7 frames. Motion blur disabled 4 frames. Subsurface scattering disabled, order independent transparency disabled for 7 extra frames, and that will give us a total performance gain of 88 frames per second, which is absolutely incredible. Remember, if you decide to disable the dynamic shadows, then your performance gain will be 100 frames per second. And now, you finally know what all the graphic settings do in Cold War, and now you also know how to use them to your advantage. So make sure to like, subscribe, and perhaps even comment if you learned something new. This was Photographer Gaming, thanks for watching, and I will see you in Cold War.